Okay, everybody ready?
Yes, we're ready.
This
Yes.
photograph, this portrait that I have here is a self-portrait that I did. I had grown out my beard for a photographic project, and it never happened, but I decided to do a little selfie just for fun. And it was inspired by this image of Ernest Hemingway that was taken by Joseph Karsh. He was a Canadian photographer out of Ottawa. And he became famous after photographing Winston Churchill.
That
Yeah.
is that's the slides for yourself, I believe. Switched it.
Are you not getting it?
No, I see your notes for yourself.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Let me get out of this.
Yeah.
We did. Okay, stop share. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Well, again,
That was fun.
Okay, they switched screens on me for some reason.
No, it was working.
It was fine to me
It was
before.
To me as well.
Yeah, it was fine to me as well. I saw Hemingway's portrait.
Okay. Let's
There's
see.
some notes for himself. There's a two screen. There are two screen. There's a two set of slide.
Yeah, there's it shouldn't be.
I saw the notes. That's
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to see the notes. Can you see that now?
notes. I saw the notes.
Are you looking at
Well,
the
that
notes?
was fine before for me, and this is not right. And that before is right.
Right. Yeah. Before
Right.
take your time.
Before was
Yeah.
okay. We'll do it again.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Screen two. Share. Okay, how's it look now?
Yeah, look
Good.
good.
Yep.
Great.
Let's get going. Anyway, the photograph again.
No, the second slide is.
That's a correct
notes.
one. That's a
It
correct
is good. It's good.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Anyway, I took inspiration from Joseph Karsh's photograph or portrait of Ernest Hemingway, and the guy was one of the greatest portrait photographers of the 20th century. And I saw some of his work on display at a museum at a local university. They had a display for a while, and he's photographed anybody that was anybody. He's photographed, and and he does amazing work. Anyway, there's a couple of differences in these two portraits I kind of want you to see. One of them are the highlights on Hemingway's portraits are more specular than the portraits on my face, and it's really subtle, a little bit hard to see here, but he was photographed, I'm pretty sure, with Fresnel lights that have Fresnel lenses on them, which gives you a more specular highlight. And I photographed myself with a softbox, and so it's a little bit different in the lighting. The other thing is he created a kind of a loop lighting pattern with this shadow under the nose, and I'm gonna use the pointer here, and I've got more of a butterfly light, often called a paramount lighting. Anyway, with a little shadow underneath my nose. And just a little bit about me. I've had a camera in my hand since I was about maybe 7 years old or so. And I just like to take pictures of other things that I was doing. Typical of other people with a Kodak Brownie camera. I got more serious in junior high and taught myself to develop film and print photographs. I wasn't very good at it. I didn't have a mentor to kind of tell me I was doing things right or wrong. And I actually bought my first professional level 35 millimeter camera when I was, well, let's see, we bought it on, we were in vacation in Hong Kong. And so I bought this thing in Hong Kong, and it was a Topcon Super D. And it not really well known, but it was the first SLR that had through the lens metering. And it was a phenomenal camera with great lenses. Anyway, when I went off to college, I majored in communications with an emphasis in photography. And at that time, I had no intention of being a professional photographer. And then after graduation, I went to Air Force undergraduate pilot training. And I flew airplanes for the Air Force for a number of years. In 1987, I joined Delta Airlines. And then I retired from Delta in September 2005 and started a little photography business. Anyway, I'm a member of PPA, a master photographer, photographic craftsman, and I'm certified actually, and used to work as a state liaison in the certification program. And then, and as been said already, I'm a member of Intermountain Professional Photographers Association, IPPA. This photograph was taken on my final trip. It's a tradition at Delta Airlines that your wife accompany you when you're on your last flight, and it was a charter flight. We ferried an airplane up to Chicago Midway, picked up the Los Angeles Dodgers, and took them to Denver, and then ferried the airplane home. Anyway, my co-pilot was a photobug, so he took some portraits of us out around the airplane while we were waiting for the Dodgers. Here's my contact information. My phone number, my email, and that's my website, my professional Facebook site, and then Instagram. And this photograph was taken by Elizabeth Taylor Franson. She's a consummate wedding photographer here in Utah, and we were teaching a PPA one day photography class, and we were out and about. And anyway, she took this photograph. I like it because when I'm doing landscape photography, this is how I roll. I put the camera on a tripod and I just go hiking. And that makes the camera available to me. And it just, anyway, it just makes it easy to sit and take a photograph. Anyway, Sam asked me to talk about the World Cup experience back in 2020, I started photographing the wild horses out on the Utah's West Desert. They're referred to as the Onaqui herd, named after the mountains that are out there. And anyway, on this particular day, I had gone out and I found the herd near a watering trough. And so I parked my truck up on a little hill above that. And there were already 3 photographers there. And they were sitting in lawn chairs next to their vehicles in the shade. And they were taking pictures. I talked to them for a few minutes and exchanged pleasantries. And then I walked down the hill into the middle of the herd. And I stayed off to their left a little bit just to be polite and not get in their photographs. And anyway, I was photographing, and these 2 horses started fighting. And they got up on their rear legs, and they were going at it. And the dark horse pushed the light horse over on its back, and that was toward me. And I hit him as he landed on the ground, and with all the spit coming out and the dust flying around. And when I got home and realized what I had, I decided to enter it in the IPPA competition the following spring. So I guess it was probably March of 2021. I entered this in competition, and one of the judges got really excited about it, and he ran the score up into the 90s. So I got really excited, and I later on that year in the fall, I entered it into IPC. And the image received an image of excellence, and that was that. And about a week and a half after the competition ended, I got a note from Rich Newell, who runs the competition, and he told me that they wanted to enter this in the World Photographic Cup under reportage, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining Team USA. Well, duh. So anyway, and then he told me not to tell anybody until December 7th, which was like a month and a half away. And I was pumping so much adrenaline, I had to go out and walk around the block for a while to kind of dissipate that. And anyway, fast forward to imaging in January 2022 in Washington during the awards ceremony. The CEO of World Cup via the internet announced all the finalists in the competition. And I'll never forget that moment where he said, Ted York, USA. And I think I was walking around in a daze for about an hour after that. Anyway, and then in April, my wife and I flew to Italy, and we spent a couple of weeks touring around and just vacationing, taking a lot of pictures. And then we attended the awards ceremony on May 3rd, I believe. And I was awarded the gold medal. And I couldn't believe it because even from the beginning, I had no idea I would go that far. And I think that was kind of the fun point. But I wanted to back up and talk about the three photographers who sat on the hill and in their lawn chairs. You can't get a photograph like this sitting in your lawn chair. You have to venture out. You have to be adventurous. And anyway, I thought I'd go on just show you just some general pictures that I had taken, not very many, because we've got other things to talk about. But these are the kind of images that I look for when I'm out there. And it's I've gotten to know a lot of these horses. This was a watering hole out there that was filled with water. We've had a lot of rain and snow this last year. And these are just some of the kinds of pictures that I take. And it's for me, it's quite an experience to be out there, and I enjoy that. And I've taken quite a few friends out there, and it's been a lot of fun. Anyway, when I was in college, my major required me to take a philosophy class, something about aesthetics. And I didn't know anything about philosophy or what they would teach. And I got into this class, and I don't think I understood one thing this guy was teaching the entire time, except for one thing, and that's he hated photography. One time he pulled out a centerfold advertisement out of Reader's Digest. Excuse me, and it was a takeoff. It was a photograph that was a takeoff of some famous painting, and I don't remember what it was. I wasn't familiar with it. And he was very critical of the photography. And I thought it was a little unfair because he was comparing a commercial photographer who was selling products to a fine art, master painter. And even to compare photography to painting is unfair because it's just different. And so I came out of there, I'm kind of a contrarian. I came out of there, wanting to prove to the world that photography was an art form. And I began to see myself as an artist who simply uses a camera instead of paint or a chisel or whatever your medium is. Anyway, this particular photograph here, I took in outside of a small town in Utah called Hanksville. And this was an image of excellence for me. In fact, for whatever reason, there were 9 judges on the panel, and they all voted unanimously, so that made me happy. And it looks warm and inviting, but it was very cold. It was all I could do to take my hand out of my glove to snap the shutter. But anyway, there's lots of light and shadow, obviously, in this photograph. Anyway, photography descended from painting. You know, painters discovered, somebody figured out you could do a pinhole in a tent, and it would project an image on the opposite wall in the tent. And they could trace that before they started painting. And then the lens was invented, and that led to the camera obscura, which was used by painters to trace their images on the media that they were using. And it was controversial. A while back, I found a quote from a painter that was asked about the camera obscura and what he thought about it. And he said, well, if you're not able to create a painting without it, then it's a crutch. And I'm just paraphrasing. But then he said, if you can paint without it, then it becomes a useful tool. In other words, it makes your job easier. Some of the developments that came along that started back here, of course, they discovered light sensitive emulsions. And then, of course, the lens created brought along the camera obscura, and then the ability finally to fix the image, to stop the reaction between the light and the emulsion, so that you would have a photograph set in stone. And then, of course, way later, Kodak came along and put the emulsion on roll film, and that really changed things. This particular image down here is the very first known photograph ever taken. And they dated it around 1825. And it was taken by Joseph, if I can pronounce it, Niepce. And he called it a heliograph. And if I know anything about Greek, I guess it's basically writing with the sun, or light, I guess, sunlight. And I don't know, it's hard to see here. It's not a great image, but there's a tree in the background and then some buildings. I think he photographed it from a porch or something. But anyway, with the advent of photography, painters had to improve their craft. And of course, Kodak's roll film led to an era of snapshots. People who were out just, that you could take your own camera, create your own pictures while you were on vacation. So, of course, you had to send them off to be developed, and you would get these little tiny prints that you would put in a book. But anyway, digital photography, of course, has led to the age of digital snap shooters. I mean, every person in the world nowadays has a camera, because if they have a phone, they have a camera. And of course, there's just crazy things that are photographed, the breakfast you had at some restaurant and all these kinds of things. Anyway, and then so professional photographers had to start improving their craft. And a lot of people, we're photographing with DSLRs now, fairly easy, because they had instant feedback on the back of their camera. It doesn't mean they know anything about photography, they just could take pictures. And of course, I'm not criticizing beginners at all. We all started there, and I still look at myself as learning about photography. So, I'm just saying, there's a lot of people don't really care about art. They take a picture of somebody, and the neighbor thinks it's cute and say, here, I'll pay you a few dollars to, photograph my kids or something like that. So anyway, basically what I'm trying to say is photographers are having to pay more attention to the principles of art in order to stand out from the hordes of photographers who are around them. Posing, lighting, color, composition, texture, expression, all these things have become more and more important. to having a business and creating beautiful sellable photographs. So anyway, this brings me to the main topic of light and shadow. And you'll hear people say all the time, you know, photography is all about the light. And I beg to differ on that. It's kind of a team sport. You have to not only have light, but you have to have shadow. In these two photographs, there's lots of light, but there's not a lot of shadow. And the photographs are somewhat boring. You can pick up a little bit of shadow through here, but it's all very subtle. And it's fine for the portrait over here. We do have nice light on her face. But when you look down at the sand, if you look at it in terms of a landscape photograph, it's very boring and very blah, because there's not enough shadow. But as soon as the sun hits and you photograph the right direction, it's like bang. You've got the sun creating the highlights on the top of the ridges in the sand, and you've got beautiful shadows behind that, and it creates this impression of 3-dimension. Even in the clouds, you have highlights and shadow giving dimension to the photographs. Here's another one that I took at a different location, but I was walking along the top of the sand dune, and the sun popped up, and it created all these beautiful highlights in the sand. And there's a lot of texture there because it's highlighting the individual grains of sand and creating little shadows there. And that's how you see that texture. And then, of course, the lines on the back side of the ridges are all black shadows. And another thing that you'll notice in this, if you understand it, is that the shadows up front, closest to the camera, are very dark. But as you taper off toward the back end, they become lighter and lighter to where you have just light grays. And that again gives you the impression of what we're going to refer to as depth. But it's about creating the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. Again, it's not just about the light, other than having the light rake across your subject in such a way as to not only illuminate your subject, but also to create interesting shadows. And so it's that combination of light and shadows that create the illusion of 3 dimensions. And this is what we refer to as depth in a photograph. If you just learn that one concept and apply it to your work or think about it as you continue, your work will improve exponentially. And of course, there's a lot more than just light and shadow to creating depth in an image, but that's what we're going to concentrate on, along with finding ways to find that light as you're out and about or working on an image. This is another image I took down in Hanksville that just shows the amount of depth that you're going to get in a photograph. And you have the highlights in here from the rising sun, creating these highlights, and along with the shadows that add kind of a 3-dimension to the rock formations in the foreground. But as you look toward the back, where everything is lighter and it gets lighter still, that also creates that illusion. It's like the dark lines in the sand that grow lighter and lighter as you go on. So you almost look like you look at this and feel like you can jump into it and go somewhere if you could kind of fly through that image. And that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. And something else I want to stress is not every photograph you take is going to be an award-winning image, one that goes on and wins the top photograph in a competition. And Ansel Adams, for those of you who are familiar with him, once said that 12 significant photographs in any one year is a good crop, because everything has to come together. you know, every day you will be out, or you'll be given opportunities to create images. But unlike painting, in painting, you just add what you want. But photography is subtractive. We start out with this scene and it's there, and you've got various numerous things there, and you have to learn to subtract what you don't want to single out whatever it is that tells your story. So you start with this collection of objects in a scene, and you essentially have to edit out things to obtain your objective. Telephone poles where you don't want them, or, you know, getting away from landscape photography, maybe the client shows up in horribly distasteful clothing despite your consultation. The sun is not very exciting. There's not a great sunset. There's too many clouds, or maybe one of your lights is not working, so you have to go from 3 lights to 2 lights. But to have everything come together in perfect composition of subject, light, story, etc., doesn't happen every day. But obviously, we can, in a studio environment, we can kind of create it. But even then, how easy is it to get the expression out of your model or whoever you're photographing, or to afford that expensive background that, or to rent a beautiful building with an elegant staircase or something that you need to create the perfect image. But there's hope. And number one, every image does not need to be perfect. We just have to wrestle with all the factors that we can control, and doing that will bring you a lot of fun and interesting photographs, and or just a successful image that will bring you satisfaction and work and make you what we call green merits or money. But the fun is increasing your skills every time you go out to shoot. So I'm going to show you a lot of situations that I've been in and things I've done. And they're not necessarily award-winning photographs, but they're photographs that either made me money or given me a lot of pleasure and are interesting for other people to look at. So what I want to do is fire up your creative juices, get them flowing, and inspire you to be thinking about learning these new skills and techniques, and looking more at light and shadow as you do your work. Last fall, I was hired by the Mike Lee senatorial campaign to cover the last few weeks of his campaign during the midterm elections. And this particular night, we went into this venue and there was no light. You can't do any photography when there's no light. And not that there wasn't any. You can see can lights in the background, but they were very dim and not the best kind of lighting for what I needed to do. So I had to resort to an on-camera flash, which is not my favorite. But I did a couple things to make this at least viable. And number one, I dragged the shutter. And dragging the shutter is shooting at a slower shutter speed so that you can pick up some of the ambient light in the background. I didn't want the background to be really light, or I'm sorry, really dark, so that everything would be, you know, my clients or the people I photograph would be just stark. And so I slowed the shutter speed down about 1/80th of a second so I would pick up some of that light, but not so much that I would pick up everything and it would start competing with the people that I photographed. The second thing I did was I programmed the flash to give me -1 stop of exposure. I was using TTL for exposing, and what happens is the TTL takes everything into consideration, so it looks at all the blackness and it wants to feed more light out than you really need to pick up the subject. So by doing -1 stop, it doesn't make the clients look like, you know, they've been flashed. So it makes a more bearable image, but it is somewhat flat because anything that's photographing from behind you at the subject you're looking at gives you flat lighting. There's no shadows. And, but they were soluble images and did what I needed it to do. On this evening, we're in a gymnasium with lots of ambient light. I still had to photograph. I had to photograph at 1600 ISO, but I had more opportunity for shadows in the lighting, and so it gave me just a. It wasn't perfect, but it gives me a lot more interesting light, I think, than shooting with flash. And here's a photograph. I just anyway, I just took of the venue basically. You'll see a guy here with a great big lens. He's an AP photographer, but he's limited to being down here. Because I worked for the campaign, I could go anywhere I wanted. And I was always doing these things where I'd come up backstage and photograph the audience with the speakers, the backs of the speakers, just to kind of tell the story. And anyway, but I just put this up to show the lighting. This is kind of a similar situation, except that we're in a theater, and the theater is basically dark, but they're using stage lighting to photograph Dr. Ben Carson, or I mean, to light Dr. Ben Carson. So I'm basically using their light. And you'll notice it's a very harsh lighting. I don't know whether they were Fresnel lenses or LEDs, I'm not sure. But you can see by the shadow underneath the microphone and his arm that they're very distinct. It goes right from shadow to light, which is basically the definition of sharp lighting. But there was plenty of light on his face coming from various directions. So that was pretty good to me. And there was, like I said, there's just a little, it accents his face in a way where there's a little bit of dimension. We were coming down from the senator's suite in an elevator, and you'll notice I have an on-camera flash. It was mostly turned off for the night, and I didn't use it here. And the ceiling in the elevator was mirrored, so you could look up and see everybody. And so I left the flash off. I had to crank the ISO to 3200 to get this image, but I aimed up with at the wide angle end of my lens, and I told everybody to look up, and they all looked up, and I used that little little can light to light everybody. And everybody that looked up, there's always somebody. These two are too interested in their phones, but they looked up, and I was able to capture this image. It's not an award-winning image, but it's a storytelling image, and everybody had fun with it. And along with that, don't be afraid of high ISOs. Our modern cameras are able to deal with that quite well. This is my favorite photograph of the night. There was not a light. There's not a lot of light in this room, but I had people helping me out. If you'll see in the back here, the press and the people with the video cameras had big lights on their cameras that light up the subject. So a guy back here filming is getting a nice flat light, if you can even see the senator. But what I'm getting is nice rim lighting around the senator. And it also is providing separation in a lot of the other people around the venue. There's a little separation here, separation light here. And so I'm using their lights to get great light in capturing this particular image. And what's interesting is two people have held up cell phones to take pictures, and I can see the senator in their cell phones. So that makes this a very nice shot. Maybe I'll send it to competition. I think I mentioned I was teaching high school last year, and I was teaching my students about hard and soft light. So I took them into a stairwell. I had big windows all facing south, so we were getting very contrasty light. And I turned this student to get a clean, normally I don't like to photograph a gal from this side, but it gives me a nice set of clean light. And it's an interesting photograph. It's not a beautiful portrait, but it's an interesting portrait because I'm still getting shadows in here that define her face. And it makes a kind of a different image. Here's another case where we're outdoors and it's a little hazy, but still we have contrasty light. And we're up in the hills behind my house. And I was walking with my grandson, one of my grandsons, I should say. And there's a guy that owns this property up here as an artist. He builds big stained glass windows. And anyway, he's created these cairns out of rocks. Very interesting. And this is an old fence post that's been there for 1,000,000 years. And he started decorating it with essentially just odds and ends. And my grandson was looking at it, and I told him just to turn his head a little. So I got clean light on his face. And it's not necessarily a beautiful light, but it's fairly clean. You can see his face, and there are some shadows defining his face. What you don't want to do is this. And this, you see this a lot with some amateur photographers or just people out taking snapshots of themselves on vacation and that kind of thing. And you've got all these distracting shadows on her face. Her eyes, all her eyes are invisible, what we lovingly call raccoon eyes. And it's the same here. You've got this bright highlight, but you can't really see anything else. About the only one you can see is this kid, because he's lit up here a little bit. This would have been better had they been turned with their backs to the sun and maybe lit up with a little flash. But posing for lighting is better than posing for the subject. And of course, I know people on vacation. Here I am at the Eiffel Tower or whatever, and people want to see that. But this is essentially bad photography. I went out to the Salt Flats and met a couple of they were seniors in high school. And you're only seeing one here, but this is my lighting setup. And I turned his back to the sun. And I was looking for something really stark, really with a lot of impact. So I turned their backs to the sun, and you can see the high contrast shadow coming out from him due to the sun. And but what this does is give me a clean face with nothing on it, not a very well exposed face, but relatively clean. No bright highlights off his nose or anything like that. Then what I do is I set the shutter speed to the maximum flash synchronization speed. In this case, with this camera, it was 1/200th of a second. And then I dial down the f-stop until I have the ambient the ambient exposure the way I want it. Here I'm making sure I'm not blowing out the whites in these clouds. I'm not worried too much about the sun. You're going to do that anyway. But anyway, and along with that, sometimes it's hard to meter. And when you've got really small areas you're worried about, it's easy just to go into the camera. I use the histogram, but the histogram is too small sometimes to see little bits, areas that are problem areas. So what I do is I've set the camera to flash the little blinkies wherever it's blown something out. And so I double check that. Once I have that exposure set in the camera, then, and this is, of course, this is the picture I get, but it's too dark in the faces. And some people might try to bring that out in post-production, but I don't think that's giving you the best quality that you can get. And so anyway, then I turn on the light and increase the power to where it will work with whatever f-stop I have set with that ambient temperature. And you have to have a powerful flash. So I have to crank up the power. And if I don't have enough power, then I have to bring it closer to the subject, if that makes sense. If you want to use a large f-stop because you want to reduce the depth of field, then you may not be able to get that ambient exposure out in the sun. So you've got to use neutral density filters on the camera. And that opens up some difficulties, but it can be done. But here are the results. I've got my ambient exposure, nothing's blowing out here, and I've got a nicely lit face. And here's one with the two twins together. I really like this one here. I like the pose. I like the light on his face. Notice we got an airplane flying by. But anyway, and this is what we did. We started photographing in the late afternoon so that we could do this. And I'll show you some pictures later as the light went down towards sunset. Here's a situation where I deliberately photographed in hard light because I was looking for this shadow of the elk. This is at one of my boys has a small elk ranch, so they are penned. But so I didn't just find this thing out in the wild. But anyway, I photographed him with a drone. So I flew my drone overhead, and I looked for the composition that I wanted, and it worked out perfectly because the bull elk took interest in the drone and looked up at the drone. So he gave me the perfect pose, which accentuated his antlers, both there and in the shadows. This is a photograph of a temple belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints just outside of Rome in Italy. And it was late in the day. The sun is still up and it's intense light against this pretty close to white structure, white or very light gray. So I had to adjust my exposure and make sure I didn't, excuse me, my throat's getting a little dry here. But anyway, the various shadows and the different intensity of light on this building helped me to create again, that three-dimensional effect. The only thing I couldn't get rid of was this metal statue with, I don't know whether it has gold leaf on it or what, but it essentially gave me a specular highlight that I couldn't get rid of. But because of its size, specular highlights are not that bad in the image. Sometimes you just have them. And I want to intervene here with a soft light image that I took of a similar structure. This is up in Rexburg, Idaho. And I photographed this very early in the morning before the sun came up. And of course, I was lucky. I got spectacular color in the sky. And the highlights in this building are actually lights that they use to light the building. And so that kind of added to my photograph. But otherwise, so you're not seeing glaring sun here, but that added to my photograph. So anyway, the rest of the lighting on here is very, very soft lighting. Here's a photograph I took up in the mountains one spring. And this would be very dull, except for this streak of hard light, or shining and accenting the top of this hill, which separates it from this hill back here. But most of the image is in shadow. And this is, you got to be very careful about exposing this. You can't really meter it. You have to get close and check your histogram and then check your photograph to make sure there's no blinkies in that, just because it's so narrow. But anyway, it's that highlight that turns it into a nice and interesting image. This is another photograph taken in the early morning. This is taken again off those same cliffs that we were in near Hanksville. I dropped it into black and white, and the sun was still low, and it created all these valleys and shadows and highlights. And this print actually scored 100 during one of the competitions. I really enjoyed it. It did get an image of excellence in IPC. Now here, my wife and I were hiking through a canyon in Capitol Reef National Park, about a 3-hour drive from here. And it was actually fairly late in the morning. It was somewhere between 10 or 11. And of course, this is high contrast light, but there's plenty of shadow down in the canyon because this is a deep canyon with very tall and straight walls. But it created this interesting light pattern. And of course, I set my exposure for this area, for the light area. You can see a little highlight on the top of her head that helps you to, it helps to separate her from the shadows so that you can tell she's there. And then, of course, in post-production, I can bring out the shadows, which on the back of the camera at this point look very dark. I photographed a football team, or I have photographed them for the last 3 years. And we start out, when we're doing the team photographs, we start early in the morning to do it in shadow. And we first put the entire team up on the grandstand. I get up on a big ladder and photograph them with available light, because I have no way to light them. Then we come down on the field, and I have one light off to the off toward the camera a little bit to the side that I use to highlight their faces a little bit. And we photograph all the special teams, the quarterbacks, the receivers, et cetera, et cetera. And when I took this photograph, we were about 2 groups from finishing up when this happened. Bang, the sun rose above the mountains. Well, now what am I going to do? And I had to think fast, but it was a simple procedure. I just dialed down the f-stop. I was already at the fastest flash sync speed, and I dialed down the aperture. And some people would accept this, and they would, maybe lighten their faces a little bit in post-production, but who has time for that? And it's not going to look the same. But I dialed it down to where I wasn't blowing out everything. And then after I did that, I adjusted the power on my flash and I don't really remember, or moved it up a little bit closer to them to get more light. And this is what I got. And you can see the difference. And I kind of like this better than the totally in the shadow lights because I like the contrasted shadows coming off of them because of the sun. And it's kind of a bit like my salt flats photograph, but this is a more acceptable photograph. Now back to the twins and the salt flats. This is the end of the day as the sun is setting. I think there's a little bit of light up because I see some highlights down here in the salt, and I am lighting them with a softbox to provide some direction and definition. And we'll soften things up a little bit here for a little family portraiture. This is a family in town here, and he's a kind of he's an artist, so I had him bring out a painting, and we used that to kind of define their family a little bit. And it's the end of the day, and I'm getting lots of ambient light, skylight coming down, and it's creating highlights in the sides of the face, the nose a little bit, I think, and mostly in Dad in the clothes. And then I have a fill flash coming in from this direction to light up the shadows a little bit and to make it a nicer portrait. Okay, this is terrible, but Anyway, I had a bunch of grandkids over one day, and I asked them to help me. I wanted to run a test. I was getting ready to do a photograph of a large group and what was looking to be a contrasty situation. And so I just wanted to get my ducks in line. So we went across the street in this yard that had all this shadow from trees and bushes. And I deliberately put them in shade. Then I adjusted my exposure to where I wasn't blowing out that car in the background. When I got that arranged, then I turned on the flash and adjusted the power to light up their faces, and this is what I got. Now the strobe is close to my camera, which you have to do with a lot of big groups. Otherwise, you risk getting shadows from one person to the next. And so, and that was the group I was going to have to deal with. So I photographed like that. So this is much like that on-camera flash. So it's a little bit dull, but it's kind of what you have to do. But just be careful not to overdo it, as they say. Here we have skylight coming down. It's lighting up the tops of their heads and their clothing. And then I have, again, a fill light near the camera that's bringing light into the photograph. But I didn't do what I did in the other photograph. I didn't light it up so much that it just flattened everything out. I just wanted to add a little bit of light. I needed some shadow. And you can meter this, and the new Seikonic meters that I've used will actually tell you how much light is ambient and how much light is coming from your flash. And I generally look for 20 to 30% of flashlight. I don't want much more to that. I've met some photographers who use 40, but it's a kind of a taste thing, but this is my preference. I put this in just to tell you, like you guys back east that have all these woods and things up in New England, and run into this where
你看
you
他们
get
做
a
这
color.
种不是粘一排啊，它这样错落有致啊，
I,
3个人啊，
I'm
在那
hearing
个错落
somebody
中
talking.
间。
Anyway,
看一下人家这个文字，我估计你也
我可以
看不懂。
看得懂，可以看一点。
okay. Anyway, when you have to be careful if you're doing this available light because you'll get a green color cast on their faces. And so pulling in some flashlight can help alleviate that by, putting 5600K light into their faces and overcoming that. You can also do a custom color balance in your camera using a gray target. I think I've got a picture of one here. This is a target I use. It folds out, and you can photograph this and then use your camera's settings based on this image to create a custom color balance. Or you can just put this in your first photograph, take it out, then you can take your color picker in Lightroom or whatever program you use, and turn it to a neutral color, and then you can copy those settings to the rest of your photographs, and that'll do the same thing. Again, this is an off color. I used off camera light to provide directional light here, but I still have light coming out of the sky, lighting up her hair and accenting her clothing and her arm to provide a little bit of shape. This is mostly natural light. I think the sun has just dipped behind the mountains, but we're getting a lot of skylight, and that's lighting up her hair and again her arm and all that. And I threw in just a little bit of fill light to lighten her eyes and face. And again, more of the same. I'm using fill light again. I've got a lot of nice ambient light that then turned this into a pretty nice portrait when I was done. Now, this is a situation that I ran into. It was the grandparents or great grandparents actually it was their 50th wedding anniversary, and they wanted all the kids and grandkids and great grandkids to come in, but they didn't want to go anywhere. They wanted to do it in the yard. And the only good background I had was this line of trees, but it was on the west side of the yard. And the other options were not good. But the problem I had is they're facing east. And so we had to do this fairly early in the morning, which is difficult with a family. So I talked to the client and I said, you know, the only way we're going to be able to do this in the morning is to have the family come in and be here by 7 o'clock in the morning. Because by 8 o'clock, it was not going to be any good. So, and unbelievable to me, she got them all there. And we made the arrangements pretty fast. We got everybody arranged. And I used off-camera light to light them up. But if like in the football picture, if the sun had risen, it would have blinded them. There would have been no solution to the problem, except to go to a totally different location. So this worked out very well for us. This is a late afternoon on their back steps that come down from their home. And we're getting backlight off the sky that's highlighting them from the back and some of their clothing. And then I have a fill light coming in this direction. Again, it's like 20 or 30%. So I'm still getting some of the highlights from the sky, but I'm also not having to deal with bad shadows. I photographed this family out on the salt flats where I had done the twins, and we were actually waiting for sunset. And we actually used an image. We actually printed an image for them off the lighting after the sun set. But I went back and revisited this out of an interest after spending a little time studying hard light. And I kind of enjoy the impact here. I still would sell the more softly lit, but this is not blowing. It's on the verge of blowing out, but it's not. But it just increases a lot of the impact. And when you look back at the shadows that light creates on the salt, it makes a kind of an interesting photograph. These little gals were photographed in the shade of the building, and again, I used a little bit of strobe to go in and light them up a little bit. Okay, this was the last photograph that I took of these twin boys toward the sunset, and it might raise the question of whether this is hard or soft light. And I would tell you that it is soft light. Of course, because these are really not shadows. I guess they are in that they are not lit. It's the shadowed side of their body, but the sharpness is because of them. And if I was to walk around the other side, photograph this direction, although it would be dark, it would be a very soft light. But here we wanted the silhouettes. And what's interesting is I was worried about them all being dark down here where their legs are, but the white salt picked up light from the sky and gave me just a little fill light in there so that you could see their legs and their feet. But you'll notice there's not really any significant shadows down here. So that tells me it's very soft to flat light. And here's one I took a little bit earlier, the opposite direction. And you can see the sky changing as the sun set, and this is all very soft. So anyway, let's head indoors. This is that football team. I brought them into the weight room to do this captain's portrait. And we did it vertically to fit the magazine, and it worked for the composition anyway. I didn't have a lot of room to work with because of all the weight machines and things that were in there. But I set up one light to rake across their faces to give them a little directional lighting. And again, that light and shadow on their faces. And the light is not pointed directly at them. I just use the edge of the light to rake across there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then I added some texture to the photograph. And it's kind of a signature shot that I do for these football teams. I go down to San Diego, or I've at least gone down there now 3 times now. But this is my first time back in 2019. And I take a week-long school called West Coast School. And I took this class from Tim Myers on lighting, and this guy is the guru of lighting. But anyway, there was a day when we went out and photographed models around the campus. And I brought this model in, and I posed her facing what is a window light coming in from the camera right. And if she had been looking that direction, it would have been a little bit flat. But I got her to turn her head toward me a little bit, and that created some shadow on her nose and in her cheekbones. And so that turned into a very nice, soft portrait for me. In this case, I turned her head toward the window a little bit, and look what kind of light we created, and how this light coming down the bridge of her nose and around her lips created, or well, it defined her facial features, and it's very light. Let's see, a couple of photo buddies and we went out, we drove the old Pony Express Road all the way out to Ely, Nevada. And we were photographing they have an old railroad that it's a tourist railroad now, but it used to service the open pit copper mine. And they had a smelter on the other side of the valley, and they would haul ore and that kind of thing back and forth. Anyway, it's a tourist railroad now, but they let you go into the engine house where they do the repair work and photograph. And this is my buddy. He was overtaking some pictures, and I noticed this nice light coming down and illuminating his face and chest here. So I took a quick snapshot, and I really like the image. It's quite nice and subtle. And I don't think he's seen it yet. Back before I had my studio opened up, I would photograph in my dining room. We'd clean everything out. I'd put up a backdrop. And this day I was being a little lazy, and I used window light coming in our French doors, and it lit him up wonderfully. Again, it shows all its facial features. And this is, by the way, called short lighting, because I'm lighting the smallest side of the face. I guess if you split the face down, split the nose down, the side of the face that's facing the camera the most, I'm not saying that right, but anyway, that's the broad side of the face, and then the face with the least amount showing to the camera is the I just drew a blank. I just said it. The short side of the face. And so by lighting the short side of the face, we call that short lighting. Anyway, not a big deal with men one way or the other, but with gals, PPA will teach you to do this because it tends to slim people. I'm not totally convinced, but anyway, that's another story. This is a kid that I was photographing, and it's the exact same thing. I use window lights, very soft, very nice. This is back in San Diego. I was photographing this model, and I had him underneath the stairs on this, well, not underneath the stairs, on the stairs, underneath this ceiling overhead. The ceiling up above prevented downlight from coming down and creating shadows in his eyes. And of course, the light came in through the side, and you can see how it nicely outlined his facial features, came down his shirt. So it's very, very nice lighting. So, and we were not using strobes or anything. This was all available light. So you can find light if you know how to look for it and how to deal with it. This is the family we were photographing. They called me up one day on like a Monday morning, and they said, we need some photographs this afternoon, which was, so I had no planning. He kind of wanted to do them outside, but it was March. March is like ugly in Utah because the grass, there's no green grass. It's all brown from being under snow all year and being cold, and it hasn't greened up. So anyway, we went up there, and fortunately it had this huge garage with a basketball set up. It was kind of like a basketball court. So we did some lit portraits of the whole family. And then I asked him to open up the garage door, which is to the camera right here. And I used that to create the lighting for this particular setup and for this one. And this was actually the very first or the very last photograph we took. There was not, the light was getting dim, and she was wearing these athletic clothes, which I really didn't want in the portrait. And there was no time for her to go back to the house and change. So her dad gave her his shirt, and anyway, we were able to create this image. And of course, this depicts that, the garage door, the ambient light coming through to light their faces. This is the same kind of thing. We photographed a garage. I got hooked up with a fellow that had quite the car collection. He had a garage that, aside from the Lamborghini and the Goose Coupe, had nothing but Mustangs. GT, Shelby Cobra. He had a GT 500, and he had Mustangs put up on metal racks, waiting to be restored. It was amazing. And because and this was precipitated by this this boy's mother said he was interested in cars. So anyway, I made that connection, and a guy allowed me to come into his garage. He would pull out cars for me. He was very accommodating, very nice. And anyway, and we photographed him using an open garage door and providing natural light. Here's an experiment I did. The walls in my studio go up to 9 feet on the left and right, and then at 9 feet they go in at 45 degrees up to the 11-foot ceiling. So I took 2 strobes, put them side by side, and I did not put a softbox or any modifier on them, other than the little metal reflector that comes with them. And I did that just to keep the light from coming directly back at us. And I aimed them up at that 45 degree and bounced it right back into the subject. Now, if I turn these lights around, I'd have a very small light source. And the smaller the light source is in relation to the subject, the more contrasty hard light you're going to get. And I didn't want to do that. So by bouncing off the wall, I turned that entire wall into a huge light source. And so I got this very soft lighting on this little boy. And anyway, and I haven't really used it as much as I'd like to because it's really a very, very nice way to create light. It's one of my award-winning images, and of course I'm just kidding. I was teaching photography for Utah Valley University across the parking lot there, and I would bring my students over to this parking garage to teach them kind of the things that we're talking about today. And of course, in the evening when I'm teaching this, there's not very many cars. In fact, there's maybe 1 or 2 cars still there. So there's plenty of room for us to work. But I want you to notice just in this photograph how the light comes in and gradually wraps itself around. And that's the kind of the definition of soft light, where there's a long transition between the lights and the shadows. And of course, there's the upper deck, which protects you from downlight. So photographing right around the edges of structures, like in porches and stuff like this, will give you phenomenal light. And this is one of the images I created the first time we did this. I shot at f1.2 just because I wanted to blur out the background a little bit, but you can see that pillar behind and how the light slowly transitions to dark. Very soft, very nice light. Now this is not shot in the garage. It was photographed in a barn, actually, with big barn doors open. And I just moved his head or body and head around to where I was getting this nice defined light. And so it was coming in a little bit of an angle to photograph the way we did. And back to the garage. Then I took my students to the very back of the garage. And you can see, let's see, there's one vehicle there. But this is our light. I mean, this was the available light there. You could do a really long exposure and get light from the front of the garage, I guess, eventually. But it didn't matter. This light was there, so we had to use it. So I got a volunteer to come in. I had to crank up my ISO, I think, to 1600. And she just did a quick pose for me. And this is what we got. So my emphasis here is that you can find light anywhere. You just have to make it work for what it is. We got an interesting shadow that went up the wall. It was kind of fun. And excuse me, just a second. Okay, anyway, and it was not too bad on her face, although I probably lightened it a little in post-production. And here's another location. It's a train station across from the college. And it, anyway, it goes underneath the tracks and you come up between the tracks to catch the train. But we photograph along these side walls under the cover. And here's an image that I was able to create. Again, there's no downlight coming down. The light is coming in this direction. And this is a, just a nice, easy, available light portrait. This is outdoors at sand dunes. This morning we had clouds that were blocking the sun. So what would normally be very dark shadows were fairly light and subtle. And in this case, it just worked for this photograph. But again, it's that light and shadow that creates the dimension here. This is the same day, but the clouds are kind of cleared out to the west, but we were still getting that soft light here. So I was looking for shapes to photograph, create kind of graphic pieces. And then I turned the sky almost black. Ansel Adams used to do that with a red filter. We have to do it in kind of post-production. But anyway, it created this graphic piece. Okay, moving into the studio. This is a studio photograph of one of my grandchildren, actually. And we didn't have a lot of time. They come over on a Friday afternoon, take pictures. I wanted to take pictures of him for an event. But anyway, and all I basically used here is a key light and a fill light. And you notice we have nice light across the bridge of his nose, under his eyes, and down here, defining the features of his face. And again, we had the key light, and there was a fill light. A lot of times I use a kicker in here, but I don't think I did this day. And if I did, it wasn't very bright. And then this kind of shows it from the top. I use the arrow off this direction to make a point. You don't want to aim the kicker light directly at the subject. What you want to, if you think of the light coming out from the strobe in kind of a triangular fashion as it fans out, you want to use the edge of that light along the face, and it just creates a better image. And I didn't use these this day, so it's not an example, but I'm showing you where I could have used a hair light. I could have used a kicker light in here if I needed to. And then of course I could have lit the background if I wanted to. And those are just other lights to consider. I use a meter. I meter my lights. I'm using a meter now. I'm not using this meter anymore because Sakana came out with a meter that has a chip in it for operating Godox lights, which is what I use now. And the meter allows me to, I can just shoot one light. I can trigger one light at a time and meter each light. And then I can turn around and shoot or trip them all and meter all the lights. And when you meter all the lights after you've set everything to get your final exposure, you want to have the dome out like this. Point the dome at the key light, and then take your meter reading, and that should give you a pretty good exposure. This is the photograph I created from, I was photographing my two grandchildren with it anyway. And this kind of shows you what I do. That had the key light and the fill as usual. But this time I used a foam core reflector. And the top, this top diagram will show you. You can buy 4x8 sheets of foam core. I used gaffer's tape to tape them together. And then it's easy to stand them up in a little bit of a folded manner. And that put in the fill light because I wanted a really small ratio there. I wanted a really light feel to it. And if you don't have room for a big foam core, you know, in a studio, I mean, you don't have a big studio to put that in. You can simply make maybe a 4x4 or whatever. Somebody can hold that for you. So there's lots of ways to make it work. Here's a simple lighting. I was working with the young boys from church and hosting them for various activities. And one day I just took them in the studio and we photographed them. And my intent was to do just a one light setup, just a key light like this. But then I found this side kind of blended in, and so I put a little bit of a kicker light in the back for some of the images. And this kind of, it's not exactly the position I had it in. I think it's what I started it in, but I could close those barn doors and just put a little bit of light where I need it to be. But anyway, this is another photograph I took. And let's see. Some of my grandkids were staying with us last week. And these kids are hard to get into the studio. They don't really want to come in and have pictures taken. But her aunt, one of my daughters, had sewn a brand new dress for her, and she just really liked it. And so for a day or so, I kept telling her how I really want to take pictures of that dress. And so she came in and allowed me to photograph her. And she got a little excited about it. And we created this image. It's 2 light setup. I have the fill light and the kicker light, and that's all I did. And very simple, very elegant. That's kind of to show what I did. Now this kid doesn't like to be photographed at all. It's her older brother. But I tricked him a little bit. I said, "Can you help Grandpa?" Because he likes to help me do things. So I brought him in the studio. I said, "I got to measure my lights and stuff. Can you help me?" So I said, "Just sit on that chair." And I started moving the lights and taking meter readings. And then I let him use the meter and take his own meter reading. And then pretty soon, I got to do a test shot. So I did some test shots, and in the process was able to create a nice portrait of him. Again, it's just the key light and the fill light. And this image kind of depicts what a fill light does. It's flat light, it's direct into the subject. It kind of shoot down the nose most of the time, not always, but it just, it just gives you this plain light. And then here's the kicker light, just lights up sides and, little edges and sometimes the hair, whatever that, however you position it. Then this is the key light by itself, much like the black and white portrait I showed you just a minute ago. And then, of course, you turn them all on, and here's what you get. And that kicker light is a real key to bringing in the highlights and creating the shadows that you need for your image. Later on, I was in the mood again. I said, I'm going to do your baby brother. This kid is only 10 months old. And I remember walking out the door, and his older brother was saying, he's not going to hold still. Well, he did hold still pretty good. And I've cropped it like this because there's a big dinosaur on his pajamas that I didn't want in the photograph. But this turned out really well. It gave me and I don't like to say the word smile and have people smile, because a lot of times it's just not natural. Obviously, there's situations where you have to, but I'm looking for not a sad look, but just a non-smile or not a big smile. The exception to that is when people laugh, because when they laughed, it's quite natural. But anyway, this was a fairly decent image of this baby. And then whoop, I got the wrong one. Whoop, I'll get it. But anyway, I would say, oops, what happened here? Well, he turned and looked at the key light. So now the light on his face is very flat. And it's okay. And it's doable. And that's the way it is with babies. They're kind of hard to pose. But this is what happened. He turned and looked at that key light. But if everything had been ideal, somebody would have been there to move that key light for me, so that when he looked that direction, I would have nice shadows on his face, as well as highlights. Now, the reality of that is the baby would have turned and looked at the key light there too, being interested in what was going on. But again, we're always striving for the ideal. Now, when you have more than one person, it's the same. You just rake that light across. You have to be careful that, I was careful to pose him a little bit ahead of his mother, just enough that he didn't get a shadow from his mother on his face. The lighting pattern is a little bit different because she's facing a different direction, but that's, of course, is okay. Here's another one I did. This is meant to be edgy. I used more specular lighting in this portrait, if I remember correctly. And I came out with this edgy feeling because that's kind of what they were interested in. And of course, I use the same way you can maneuver that softbox so that you're just using the edge and that it's just raking across the people in this photograph. And you can do it. You can actually set this up and maneuver that box to where if you take an exposure here and an exposure over here, you'll be less than a half a stop off. If even that, it might be down to a quarter stop. It's a good way to train. If you have a meter, you can set something to mark a line on the floor, and you can go back and forth and play with maneuvering your softbox, the edge of that box, to where you have almost the same exposure at both ends. Let's see. Again, I'm being careful not to get shadows from one person to another. Then I tried a technique I've learned about, what I call or refer to a light within a light. And I was taking portraits of Santa Claus. This is a new guy coming onto our team. We're big into Santa Claus photography. And Anyway, at the very end of the session, I tried this light within a light thing. And when I initially looked at the back of the camera, I said, nah, this is not very exciting. And we quit, we terminated. And he went home and I went in to download the photographs. When I downloaded the photographs, I was amazed. It was pretty close to what I was looking for. And it's a bit contrasty because you're using a Fresnel lens, but everything else is soft because the fill light is filling out here where the Fresnel lens is focused in here. And of course, this is the first time I tried it, so it's not it's not exactly perfect. But I was enamored with it. And basically you have a fill light, and right in front of it, you have a key light pointed at your subject. You focus in that key light for the face, and you let the fill light do its thing. If you were if you were the Santa Claus sitting in that position, this is what you would see: the key light and the fill light. I took a class on Hollywood lighting, and that's basically what we did. We were down in Santa Ana, California, and this is a Fresnel lens, focusable lens where you can control the amount of light, or the spread of the light actually. And the fill light is right behind it. This is a portrait I did of a model. And again, we have downlight coming down, creating the light to define her cheekbones. And this is harsh lighting. I mean, this is hard lighting. And it has to be properly retouched, but it's somewhat spectacular, and I really enjoyed doing this. Same thing here. Contrasty lighting, provided with, again, by that Fresnel lens. We do have some kicker light coming in here and around. And of course, the fill light was on this side, same side as the hard light. So it's filling in here nicely. And to help bring out that shadow, of course, we did a little bit of a kicker light. And this was taken with a beauty dish, which kind of did the same thing, except that it spread the light. You couldn't control the spread of the light, but we just took off the sock and photographed just with the beauty dish, and we were able to create, while the light's a little bit softer on the edges, we were still able to get that high contrast portrait. And this is another one that we did. And here's a solution to big family. We do a lot of big families here in Utah. And, you know, when you stack a bunch of people outside, again, you have to flat light them. But what I do is I bring them in the studio and I break it down. So this is actually 4 photographs of this family. This family's a photograph, this family's a photograph, the grandparents, another photograph, and then this family, this photograph. So I can light them more artistically without having to worry about shadows. And I have less people to worry about. I can worry about 2 or 3 kids instead of like 5 or 6 kids. And then we stitch it back and create these long panoramic portraits. And here's a big one a fairly big family. The largest one I've ever done was 8 or 9 feet long. It was huge. And I think it was a couple inches short of 9 feet long. And it was quite the project. And I had to deliver it because none of the clients had enough or big enough car to haul it down. Here's another idea for composites. I photographed her with a background, and I decided to cut her out and put her into the scene of the ice skating rink. You have to be really careful that your lighting is believable, that the lights in your background agree with the lighting in your image. And this is another one I did. I photographed him in studio, composited a barn scene. I think that was taken up in the Tetons. and added a bunch of texture to it, and created what I thought was a pretty interesting image. This is another project. I started out doing this with my grandchildren, and this was, I think, my first or second client. Anyway, mother brought him in to have his picture taken. And what I do is I dress them up as a railroad character, as engineers or whatever. And I photograph them with lanterns and different kinds of things. And then I took an image. This was taken in the Ely, Nevada engine house again. And I composited him into this image, and this is what I got. And I had to, in Photoshop, I had to create light in here, again, painting with white and just slowly building that up. And then I had to think about, well, how would he have been lit if he was standing in front of this lantern? And so I lightened these areas up to create this portrait and to make it somewhat believable. And here's another, I'm just touching on this, but again, you can do what a painter does. A painter builds up lights and dark paint pigments to create a three-dimensional photograph, and you can kind of do that too. What I did, well, this was a candid shot. I had flown out to Washington to do a wedding, and we were out looking for some locations to do bridals, and the groom put his arm around his fiance, and I just took a quick candid shot. And it's boring. I mean, there's not much dimension to it. The lighting is boring, the color's boring, blah, blah, blah. So I got to looking at it, and I thought maybe this would be interesting. And the first thing I did was take this bracelet out of the image. And then I converted it to black and white, and I started basically kind of painting, burning and dodging is what I did. And I just kept doing that till I got something I wanted. And this is what I came up with. And look at the impact, the depth of this image is so much greater. And that went on to get what they used to call the Lone Collection. It's now an image of excellence. Anyway, that's kind of the end of my lecture. I'll leave you with a comical image we did for a Christmas card. Now, I have 8 children. I have 5 boys, 3 girls, and the boys all disappeared, got married, went to college, and one of the gals was gone. I think she was in Tennessee at the time. But anyway, we took this comical photograph to depict my life with nothing but girls. I was used to having these. The boys used to outnumber the girls in our family, and now it was the opposite direction. So we wanted to get a little comic. So we went into the studio and just messed around and came up with this. So anyway, I'm at the end of the lecture, and I guess we can open it up. And I'll stop the share, if I can do that.
Great. Thank you so much. And Ted, excellent presentation. So next, I would like give chance for the audience to make a question. I know there's some question in the chat. Is Anna?
Question, Ted.
Yes.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for a great presentation. Very professional, and it's a great pleasure to watch your portrait and group photographing. I'm very impressed for your family group. Is that 100 people? The big family portraiture? Is that 100 people? I think definitely more than 50, right?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot. I can't really remember. It's been a few years ago.
I'm very impressed. You can post them together like that in the very quickly at 7 o'clock. Look, the babies wake up. Perfect. I'm very impressed, Ted. The question is, you mentioned the Sekonic meter, and you said the Godox has a Sekonic has a meter support the Godox light.
Yes. I forgot I forget the number. I want to say like 385 or something, but I'm not sure. But it's easy to find because it's the most expensive meter.
Yeah. I have a Sekonic 758. It's older, but it's very reliable.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not working perfectly with the Godox. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, the new one has a module. You can buy the module, it's extra, and you put it into that meter. The old meter I had, the one you saw in the picture, that was back when I was using Norman lights and Pocket Wizards, and that one had a radio control module for the Pocket Wizards. But the Sekonic is much better because I can control all the lights independently to meter them.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You bet.
Ted, this is a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. When you do the metering, and isn't that our camera always have a spot metering in the camera? So compare with using your camera to do the metering versus do a separate meter. What is the difference in terms of the measurement, and then which one is better?
Well, the camera's incapable of metering for flash.
I see.
You can't.
Oh, I see.
So that's I don't generally use I don't use my Sekonic meter outside when I'm measuring ambient light. I could, and the difference, first of all, in that type of meter, is that it meters the light falling on the subject. So you hold it up at the subject, pointing toward wherever the light's coming from, and you meter the light falling on the subject, where the camera reads the light that's being reflected from the subject. And
I see.
One is not necessarily better than the other, but to use a camera meter properly, well, actually, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but you have to understand metering and what the meter is doing to understand what you need for your exposure, if that makes sense. Like if you walk out on a day, we'll walk out in the morning, the sun's shining, and there's brand new snow on the ground, and your meter in your camera is telling you how to photograph that scene and create this medium gray. It's looking for medium gray because an average scene all works together to come out to that medium gray calculation. But when you get a scene that's all covered with snow, and you take the picture according to the meter, you're going to get gray, dark snow, if that makes sense. So you have to know to increase your exposure a couple of stops so that your snow will be white and everything will fall into place. Meters are not smart. They just calibrate light. But like I said, I don't generally use that type of meter outside. I usually stick to my camera. But because in the studio I'm metering lights, I have to.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ted, you just mentioned the meter. Can I understand this way? For the studio, most time some photographer use it, some photographer doesn't use it. But for the studio, most time we use the meter to measure the lights from different lights. Usually you have multiple lights, like key light and field light, kick light. So
Correct.
It's hard for the use camera to measure that kind of light.
Yeah.
I think for the ambient, for the outdoor, people usually don't use the meter. They just use the camera, the meter, the light, right?
But you could technically use it. It's called an incident light meter, whereas the meter in the camera is a reflective light meter. And actually my meter has the capability of metering reflected light, but I'm not going to carry anything extra outside, with the exception if I'm using strobes outside, then I have to use that incident light meter so I can read the light coming from the strobe, if that makes sense.
Hi, Ted. Ted.
Uh-huh.
Go ahead.
Yes, it's really a very nice presentation, and your photos are very impressive. I have a question. Some photos you showed have two apertures. For example, one photo showing f8, 2.8, and at the same time on the second line you mentioned f10 stop.
Oh. Yeah, I can understand how that's confusing. The first aperture setting is the lens itself. Like it's a 50 millimeter 1.2 lens, for instance. And then the second aperture is the actual aperture that I shot the photograph at. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. Okay then.
So the first one, I'm just
Thank you.
describing the lens is all.
Oh, okay then. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, your photos is not only showing us the pictures or the photos you share with us, how technically you express the meanings, but at the same time, it's really telling us the cultures, the people are still like, I don't know how to express, like the big family is really give us the people keeping the tradition of this. And nowadays, I think people don't care about this, but this is it only for the people, for the local people, like the Utah people using, like keep this tradition for family photos for Christmas, New Year's?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I'm doing less and less family photographs. But on the other hand, I make money. I make a lot of money in November, December, photographing kids with Santa Claus. And I don't know if you can see the picture back on my wall or see it well enough to tell what's going on. But but they love it, and they buy a lot of the pictures because they want professional pictures of their kids. And a lot of the family photographs that I take are actually grandparents that hire me to photograph the whole family. You know, I get this in the holidays sometimes. You know, everybody, all the extended family comes home for Thanksgiving or something, and so they want photographs of the kids and, you know, the whole family with the grandkids. And so I do that off and on, more often than not. The younger people tend to go toward digital images.
Yeah.
Which is really sad because I kind of understand it. They grow up in a digital world, but there's nothing like a wall portrait that can be enjoyed all the time.
Yeah, that's true.
And digital images are at a higher risk of disappearing, I think. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but anyway.
Hey,
Thank
Ted,
you.
wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot tonight. Just a quick question. From your photos, you know, most of the photos you have the eyes. That's the most striking part, you know, the highlight of the photo. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how to make those eyes shiny, you know, high contrast, and, you know, grab people's attention.
Well, you know, the first thing you do is you light it properly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you'll notice even the photographs of my children, you know, I mean, the child photographs, I'm not really big into smiles. Not that I don't like smiles, but when you tell somebody to smile, number one, it's not natural. But the other thing is people's eyes disappear.
Yeah.
When you're smiling, your eyes disappear. And to me, the you know, everybody says the eyes are the windows to the soul. And for me, when you're going along, you know, looking at photographs, you know, and you got all these smiling faces and contrast or whatever, and you kind of go, yeah. And then you come to one where they're not smiling, and I don't mean frown or mad, I just not smiling. and suddenly you can see their eyes, and it gives you reason to stop and think. But I get it all the time. I posted some of these photographs on Facebook at, you know, photography places, and where's the smile? You know, I was like, you know, I don't want people, you know, like I've had mothers go, I spent $5,000 to straighten those teeth and I want to see them. Well, yeah, the teeth are okay, but the eyes are better. Always the eyes, you know. But part of it is, you know, I kept talking about roofs and not letting that downlight, because in the natural, when you're doing natural light photography, that downlight, if a people has an inset, you know, eyes, it creates a shadow in the eyes.
Yeah.
And I've heard it over and over again called raccoon eyes, because it, you know, it just deepens those eyes and you can't really see them. So, you know, when you're outdoors, you want to, you know, I've held reflectors over the top to block that light. You know, when I'm doing a close-up photograph or something, or you look, you know, you look for things to block it, or you just bring in artificial light. And
Yes.
so that's kind of what I do.
Yeah. So in the studio, you do put the key light directly towards the eye, right? Just at the eye level. That to, you know, highlight the eyes.
No, I actually come up and come down generally about a 45-degree angle.
Oh,
roughly.
45-degree angle.
Yeah. I mean, there's, you know, and again, it depends on what I'm doing and what I want to do, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Sometimes I don't go as high, like that cowboy photograph, for instance.
Mhm.
The guy with the cowboy hat, well, you have a problem with that because that cowboy hat is going to block the flash
Yes.
getting into his eyes. So I have to lower that, you know,
Mhm.
that to get the
Yeah.
light in there, or reflect it, you know, some way.
Makes sense. Another quick question: when you took photo of this Santa Claus, you have this light inside light. I thought because the face was lit up and the face is on the top, I was thinking the the light inside the key light will be off center, just to the top. But your figure shows it's right at the center. Could you explain why you put it in the center?
I don't think it makes any difference. When you look at that photograph, that gal in the big key light, I think it was a little off center. I don't know that it's necessarily, but I'm not an expert at that yet. I'm still experimenting with that.
I see.
So I'm just playing with it.
Okay. So not necessarily the key light has to be at the center.
No, not exactly.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Next, I would like to give the chance for the people who have questions in the chat. One question here is, what portrait software do you use for post-processing?
I use Capture One Pro to as a raw processor, and I have used Lightroom, but I've gone to Capture One Pro just because I like the quality of the color. They seem to have nailed it a little better, and that doesn't mean that I don't think. In fact, actually, sometimes I think about going back to Lightroom, just because of its cataloging abilities. You know, you can put in keywords and search easily to find old images. I'm finding that really challenging now that I have terabytes and terabytes of photographs. But
another question from the
and then I use Photoshop a lot. I also use Nik software. I use that mostly in my landscape photography. It just helps me to bring tones out and stuff like that. And I use their black and white conversion software a lot too, Silver Effects Pro for black and white conversion. And I haven't made any determinations on it. Sometimes I do it in Capture One, sometimes I do it in Photoshop.
Yeah, now it's 10 o'clock. I would like to give maybe several minutes or more to go through the two questions from the chat. Then I see that David raised the hand. I would like to give David a chance Let me read another question from the chat. When you take a photo of yourself, how do you set the focus? Do you take a photo?
Oh, well, I'm using these new Canon mirrorless cameras, and you put it to eye focus, and it just nails your face. You don't have to worry about that. And I did have somebody come over and push the button for me. You know, I don't like putting it on the timer and then running. And somebody gave me an idea where you could put it on, I'm forgetting the term I want, but where it just continually takes pictures and you just let it go. But, you know, you got to keep up with the flash and that kind of stuff. So it was just easy for me to have somebody come in and trip the shutter for me.
Okay, David, do you have a question?
Sam, thank you. Yeah, Ted, it's a great presentation. I'm kind of a beginner in this area, but I couldn't learn too much from this presentation, but did learn a few. Actually, I was about asking you about the most of the subject in your photo, they don't smile. I was about asking about you kind of responded, say something, but I still want to ask you, you know, when the people ask people not smile, most of the time my subject may show like a it's too boring, emotionless, but in your photo, I can see the emotion. So how do you communicate with your subject? I mean, in the way you want they express something, or they want kind of natural, how you communicate with your subject?
Yeah, number one, I don't necessarily tell them not to smile. I tell them to relax their smile. Does that make sense? Put their lips together. Sometimes just breaking the lips a little bit makes a nice image too, but it's hard for people who are not trained models to do that. And another thing that about portraiture, it's timing. I mean, let's see, how do I explain this? When I first got a digital camera, it was just a Nikon Coolpix. You know, it was not a very sophisticated camera. And I hated it because I found out you would push the button and about 5 days later, it would take the picture. I mean, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but I couldn't do portraits. You know, I couldn't take pictures of my family or whatever with it because it didn't work for me. And I like to go out and take pictures of trains, and that didn't work. When I would do the shutter, the train would either be way back in the background or it would be past me. It was never in the right place, and it drove me crazy. And then when I finally got a DSLR, it wasn't so bad, and now it's just instantaneous. Well, sometimes I see things like the picture of my granddaughter kind of in the dress, kind of looking up a little bit. She was kind of moving, and I saw that instantly pressed, and I got that image. She didn't hold that pose for, you know, half a second. And so there's a little timing to it. You have to look for that expression as they're moving. And that's not an easy answer to your question. But like I said, even when I ask somebody to smile, or I'll say smile big, or I'll say laugh. I'll use a little humor to get them to laugh, because when they laugh, it becomes natural. They're not straining. Some people will fall into a nice smile with no problems, but other people don't. My dad was horrible. You tell him to smile and it kind of come out like, it was just hard to do. But like I said, I find pictures where the emphasis on the eyes and not the teeth are more contemplative to me. But try working with the timing. Watch the person you're photographing as they sit there, and sometimes they're not even ready for anything, and I see it and I photograph it quickly. And that's the best answer, I guess, that I can give you, if that helps at all.
Yeah, thank you.